Welcome to our deep dive today. We're tackling something that a lot of you have sent in questions about: all-inclusive deeds of trust, or ATDs, as the cool kids call them. Sounds a bit like something you'd find in a legal textbook, but actually they're getting some buzz lately, especially with interest rates being what they are. So we're going to break down what ATDs are all about, why they might be making a comeback, and what to watch out for if you're thinking about using one.
Yeah, EDs are definitely interesting. They've been around for a while, but they don't always get the spotlight. But in the right situation, they can be a win-win, both for buyers and sellers.
Okay, so let's start with the basics. What exactly is an all-inclusive deed of trust? I know some of the articles you sent over call them wraparound mortgages. Is that the same thing?
Yeah, you can pretty much use those terms interchangeably. Basically, it's a way for the seller of a property to help the buyer with the financing.
So instead of going to a bank and getting a traditional mortgage, you work directly with the seller.
That's the gist of it.
And why is that helpful? Especially when interest rates are high like they are now.
Well, think of it this way. The seller usually already has a mortgage on the property. With an AITD, the buyer takes on that existing loan. And then they also finance the rest of the purchase price through the seller.
Interesting. So the seller kind of becomes the bank.
In a way, yeah. And if that existing mortgage has a lower interest rate than current market rates, the buyer could potentially get a better deal than going to a bank.
Let's say, just for example, a house is worth $1 million. The seller already owes $800,000 on their mortgage. I, as the buyer, put down $50,000. So there's still $150,000 left to finance.
Right. In that case, the AITD would cover that remaining $150,000.
So I'd be making payments to the seller on a $950,000 loan, which includes their original $800,000 mortgage plus that extra $150,000.
Exactly. And they'd use part of those payments to keep paying down their own mortgage.
That's pretty clever. But one of the articles mentioned something called a due-on-sale clause, and it sounded like that could cause some serious problems.
Oh, yeah, the due-on-sale clause. That's definitely something to be aware of.
What is it exactly?
Well, most mortgages have this clause, and it basically says that if the property is sold, the lender can demand the whole loan be paid off right away.
So if the original lender found out about the AITD, they could say, hey, seller, you owe us the full $800,000 right now.
Yeah, that's the risk.
That sounds like a pretty big roadblock. How do people even use ATDs with that hanging over their heads?
It's definitely a concern. That's why it's so important to have an experienced real estate attorney involved. There are ways to try and mitigate the risk, like maybe getting the original lender to agree to the AITD.
So it's not something you just jump into without doing your homework?
Definitely not. It's crucial to have expert legal advice to make sure everything is done properly.
Okay, so we've got this potential landmine with the due-on-sale clause. But even if that's taken care of, why would a buyer and seller even want to go the ADT route in the first place?
There are a few reasons why ATs can be appealing, especially for buyers in a market like this. Well, one of the biggest advantages for buyers is the potential for a lower interest rate. If the seller's existing mortgage has a much lower rate than what's available right now,
Which is very likely these days.
right, then the buyer could save a lot of money over the life of the loan.
But wouldn't the seller be losing out on that low rate? Why would they want to do an AATD?
That's a good question, but they could potentially earn a higher interest rate from the buyer than what they're paying on their existing mortgage.
So they're kind of making a profit on the difference between the two rates.
Exactly. It can be a way for them to keep earning some return on the property even after they've sold it.
That makes sense. But I guess that only works if the seller's existing interest rate is a lot lower than current market rates.
You got it. If the difference is small, it might not be worth the hassle and the risk.
So ATDs aren't a magic bullet.
No, they're not for everyone. It really depends on the specific situation and the numbers involved.
And probably a good dose of expert advice.
Absolutely.
You want to make sure you understand all the ins and outs before you dive in.
Couldn't agree more.
So we've talked about the basics of ATDs and why someone might consider using one. But there's a lot more to unpack here. We need to dig into the potential risks and benefits and how to actually set one up. So stick with us. We'll be right back after a short break.
Looking forward to it.
All right, so we've got this whole interest rate dance going on with ADs, but what happens if interest rates take a nosedive after an ATD is already in place? Does that throw things off?
Yeah, that's a great point. And it brings us to another important piece of the puzzle, prepayment penalties.
Yes, prepayment penalties. One of the articles mentioned those. I remember thinking, oh boy, more legal jargon.
They sound scary, but they're actually there to protect people.
Really?
Yeah, well, at least from the seller's perspective.
Okay, so how do they work?
So imagine interest rates drop.
Like way down.
Right, and the buyer thinks, hey, I could refinance this ADD and get a much lower rate.
Which would make sense for them.
Totally. But then the seller would lose out on all that sweet interest income they were getting.
The spread we talked about earlier.
Yeah, exactly. So that's where prepayment penalties come in.
They're like a safety net for the seller.
Yeah.
To make sure they don't get left high and dry if the buyer refinances.
That's a good way to put it.
But wouldn't that make the buyer think twice about refinancing? Even if it's a good financial move for them.
It could definitely be a deterrent.
So it's like a balancing act. The seller wants protection, but you don't want to discourage the buyer too much.
Exactly.
So are there like different kinds of prepayment penalties?
Yeah, there are a few common types, like fixed penalties where it's a set dollar amount, or step-down penalties which decrease over time.
So the longer you have the AITD, the lower the penalty would be if you refinance.
All right.
Okay, that makes sense. But it sounds like it could get pretty complicated.
It can definitely get into the weeds.
Which is why having a good real estate attorney is so important.
Absolutely. They can help you figure out what type of prepayment penalty makes sense.
And make sure it's fair for both sides.
Yeah, and they'll make sure it's all spelled out clearly in the AITD agreement.
No surprises down the road.
Exactly.
So we're seeing a pattern here. ATs involve a lot of moving parts. And it's crucial to have everything in writing. With all the I's dotted and the O's crossed.
You're telling me.
Speaking of potential problems, what happens if someone defaults on their payments? Like, let's say the buyer stops paying on the ATD.
That's a big one.
What are the consequences?
Well, remember, even though the buyer is making payments to the seller is still responsible for their original mortgage.
Just like that chain of financing we talked about.
Right. So if the buyer defaults, the seller still has to keep making those payments to the original lender.
Or else what?
Or else they risk defaulting on their own mortgage.
And that could lead to foreclosure.
Yeah, it's a domino effect.
So it's not just the buyer who's on the hook here.
Nope. The seller has a lot riding on this too.
So how do you protect against that?
Well, the ATD agreement needs to be very clear about what happens if there's a default.
Like who's responsible for what?
Exactly.
And what options the seller has if the buyer doesn't pay.
Right. They might be able to tack on the missed payments to the ATD balance. Or even start foreclosure proceedings.
Okay, so it's serious business. Not something to enter into lightly.
Definitely not.
You need to have your eyes wide open.
And a good lawyer by your side.
Now, we've been focusing on ADDs in a high interest rate environment. But are there other situations where they might make sense?
Yeah, there are definitely other scenarios where ATDs can be useful.
Like what?
Well, they can be a good option for buyers who might have trouble getting a traditional mortgage.
People with lower credit scores or inconsistent income.
Right. Traditional lenders might be hesitant to give them a loan, but an ADD could give them a chance to become a homeowner.
So that's like an alternative route to homeownership.
In a way, yeah.
And since ADs can be customized, they can be adapted to different situations.
Right. You can tailor the terms to fit the specific needs of the buyer and seller.
We've been talking a lot about residential real estate. Do ADDs ever come up with commercial properties?
They do, actually. And in some ways, they can be even more suited to commercial deals.
Why is that?
Well, commercial real estate often involves more complicated financing structures, and ATDs have that flexibility to adapt.
Interesting. So ADDs aren't just about houses.
Nope, they can cover a whole range of properties.
But I imagine the rules and regulations could vary depending on where you are.
Oh, absolutely.
State laws, local ordinances, all that stuff.
Right. You need to do your homework and make sure you're following the rules in your area.
Which again highlights the importance of having a good real estate attorney in your team.
Couldn't agree more. They can help you navigate the legal maze.
So far, we've covered the what, the why, and the potential pitfalls of ATs. But let's get practical. What are the actual steps involved in setting one up? All right, so we've established ADs are a bit more hands-on than your average mortgage. Not exactly a set it and forget it kind of deal.
Yeah, you could say that.
It's like we've been given this powerful tool, but we need to make sure we know how to use it properly. So what's the step-by-step process? How do you actually set up an AITD?
Well, the first thing you got to do is really dig into those existing mortgage documents. Both the buyer and the seller need to understand every little detail of that original loan, especially those tricky clauses like the due on sale clause we talked about.
Making sure there are no hidden surprises lurking in the fine print.
Exactly. You don't want any skeletons jumping out of the closet later on.
So once you've got a handle on the original mortgage, what's next?
Then it's time for some good old-fashioned negotiation.
The buyer and seller need to hash out all the terms of the AITD.
Right. Things like the interest rate, the payment schedule, who's responsible for property taxes and insurance, all those nitty-gritty details.
And I'm guessing having a lawyer involved is pretty crucial at this stage.
Oh, absolutely. A good real estate attorney can help draft a solid AITD agreement, one that's legally sound and protects everyone involved.
So it's not just a handshake deal.
Nope, this is a binding legal contract.
With some serious implications.
Right. You want to make sure everything is spelled out clearly and correctly.
So no room for misunderstandings down the road.
Exactly.
Okay, so you've got your agreement all ironed out. What happens then?
Well, then you need to get that AITD officially recorded.
Recorded where?
With the appropriate county office.
Why is that important?
It makes the AITD a matter of public record, and it gives it legal standing.
So it's like the final stamp of approval.
You could say that.
So we've got a multi-step process here, with a lot of potential pitfalls along the way. No wonder ATDs aren't as common as traditional mortgages.
Yeah, they definitely require more effort and attention to detail.
But if you're willing to put in the work,
Mm.
and you've got a good team in your corner, they can be a great option.
Especially in a market like this, where interest rates are so volatile.
We've covered a lot of ground today, from the nuts and bolts of how ATDs work, to the potential benefits and risks, and the absolute necessity of having expert legal guidance.
It's been a deep dive for sure.
But I think it's been a worthwhile one. ATDs are definitely a more complex financing tool. But for those who are looking for creative solutions and who are willing to do their due diligence, they can open up some interesting possibilities.
I agree. They're not for everyone, but they can be a powerful tool in the right hands.
And as always, the key is to be informed. Do your research, talk to the experts, and make sure you understand what you're getting into before you sign on the dotted line.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Well, that wraps up our deep dive on all-inclusive deeds of trust. We hope you found it informative and maybe even a little bit entertaining. And if you're thinking about using an ATD, remember those wise words. Do your homework, get expert advice, and proceed with caution. Thanks for joining us on this journey into the world of ATDs. Until next time, happy investing.